CEO finds out janitor is multilingual. The outcome leaves, the office silent. She was adjusting the gold-trimmed brim of her cap when the CEO heard her navigate the complexities of a Parisian transit map in flawless native French. What happened next left the most prestigious office in Chicago in a state of absolute silence. At the global headquarters, most employees viewed the service staff as part of the architecture essential, yet entirely unnoticed. It wasn't intentional cruelty, but a corporate reflex. The service blended into the marble and glass, like the hum of the air conditioning. It was a Tuesday morning, and the lobby was a symphony of clicking heels against polished tile, the frantic rustle of morning briefings, and the steam of artisanal espressos that everyone clutched like shields. David, the high-powered CEO, was cutting a sharp path toward the elevators, his mind already 3 hours ahead in a failing European merger, when a sound snagged his attention. It was a voice crisp, melodic, and carrying the unmistakable accent of the Parisian elite. It stopped him mid-stride. He scanned the lobby, expecting to see a high-level consultant from the French delegation, but instead, he found Christina. Clad in her blue and gold service uniform, she stood over a complex map held by an elderly man in a heavy black overcoat. This was James, a VIP billionaire known for his brilliance and his legendary impatience. Yet here he was, looking at Christina with an expression of profound relief. Christina gestured calmly toward the map, her voice warm and authoritative as she switched seamlessly from French into Mandarin to clarify a logistical point for James's aid. David narrowed his eyes. He had seen her for months, a quiet figure polishing the brass luggage racks or tidying the lounge, but he had never once heard her voice. To him, she was a name tag without a story. But as he stepped closer, she concluded her explanation to James with a polite nod and turned toward a nearby courier, fluidly switching into a sharp, technical German. The transition was effortless, leaving the CEO standing in a lobby full of geniuses, realizing he had been walking past the most brilliant mind in the building. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning air in the Chicago headquarters was a thick cocktail of expensive leather and fresh lilies, a scent that usually signaled high-stakes productivity to David. As the CEO of Halberg International, he moved through the lobby with the practiced velocity of a man whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per second. Around him, the downtown bustle hummed with the rhythmic clacking of heels against polished tile and the frantic hiss of the espresso machine. A symphony of the important people, clutching coffee like it held the answers to their looming deadlines. In the center of this frantic orbit stood James, a prestigious international investor who was as elusive as he was wealthy. He looked uncharacteristically small as he struggled with a complex transit map, his brow furrowed in a confusion that the front desk staff seemed unable to remedy. David began to pivot, intending to intervene, but he was stopped, cold in his tracks, by a voice that shouldn't have been there. It was sharp, fluent, and carried the effortless cadence of the Parisian elite. He glanced around, expecting a high-level consultant, but instead saw Christina. She was dressed in her blue and gold service uniform, her hair neatly pulled back, looking every bit the invisible janitor who usually blended into the background like elevator music. Yet, there she was, gesturing calmly toward the map in James's hands. "À gauche, monsieur, après la station de métro," she said with native-level precision, her voice warm and firm. As James's eyes lit up with relief, she seamlessly transitioned, speaking a few sentences of Mandarin to his aide to clarify a logistical point. David watched, paralyzed by the sheer jarring contrast of the scene. The woman he had passed 100 times without a single word of greeting was currently performing a masterclass in diplomacy. She wrapped up the conversation and turned toward a courier, fluidly switching into technical German as if it were her first language. David stood frozen in the humming lobby, realizing that the most brilliant mind in the building had been hiding behind a name tag and a mop. David stood paralyzed as the elevator doors hissed shut, the rhythmic sound of James's departing laughter still echoing in the marble lobby. He turned back toward Christina, who had already reached for her spray bottle, her eyes fixed on a smudge on the brass luggage rack, as if the previous 3 minutes hadn't happened. The invisible cloak had descended again, but the CEO could no longer unsee the brilliance he had just witnessed. He stepped forward, his polished Oxfords clicking a slow, deliberate beat toward her. "Excuse me," David said, his voice dropping the sharp, corporate edge he used with his directors. Christina straightened, her posture composed but her expression unreadable. A mask of professional invisibility she had worn for years. That was Mandarin. And French. And was that German? She gave a small, respectful nod, her hands resting calmly on her cart. "Yes, sir," she replied simply, her English as precise as a razor. David leaned against the gold-trimmed pillar, studying the woman he had walked past every morning without a second thought. "How many?" he asked, his curiosity finally outweighing his schedule. Christina hesitated, a flicker of something, perhaps a long-buried spark of academic pride passing through her eyes before it vanished. "7, sir," fluently. "I read Latin and Greek as well, but those are for books, not lobbies." The revelation hit David with the force of a physical blow. He spent millions on international consultants and cultural sensitivity workshops, yet the most linguistically gifted person he had encountered in years was standing in front of him in a blue and gold service uniform. He looked at her name tag, seeing the person behind the plastic for the first time. "Christina," he said, the name feeling heavy with the weight of missed opportunity. "I've been looking for a global strategist for 6 months. I've interviewed people with Ivy League degrees who can't navigate a Parisian conversation as well as you just did." He realized then that his greatest untapped asset wasn't in a boardroom, it was maintaining the lobby. "I'd like you to come upstairs. We need to talk about your future, and mine." The elevator rose in a smooth, silent vacuum, the digital floor indicator climbing toward the 18th level executive suite. Inside the brushed steel cabin, Christina caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. The blue and gold service uniform, which usually felt like a protective layer of anonymity, now felt heavy and out of place. It was a suit of armor designed for the shadows of the building, not the blinding light of the summit. Beside her, David stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the doors, seemingly unaware of the social tectonic plates shifting with every floor they passed. When the doors slid open, the transition was jarring. The air changed instantly, losing the faint scent of cleaning chemicals and replacing it with the aroma of expensive citrus and polished mahogany. The floor was no longer cold tile, but a deep, plush carpet that swallowed the sound of Christina's sturdy work shoes. As she stepped out behind David, the executive hallway seemed to stretch out like another planet, one governed by silence and the subtle hum of power. David's assistant looked up from her curved marble desk, her eyes widening as they landed on Christina's blue cap and name tag. She didn't speak, but the confusion in her gaze was a physical weight. Christina kept her chin up, though her hands instinctively tightened at her sides. She felt the invisible boundary of the blue-collar world fraying as she walked past glass-walled offices where men and women in tailored gray suits paused mid-conversation to watch her pass. To them, she was a glitch in the corporate machinery, a service worker who had wandered onto the wrong floor. David gestured toward the towering double doors of his private office. Inside, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, a breathtaking sight that Christina had only ever seen while wiping the glass from the outside after hours. Now, she was on the other side of the pane. As she took a seat in a velvet-lined chair, she realized the view from the top wasn't just about the height. It was about the crushing realization of how much she had been capable of while the world only saw a uniform. The conference room felt like a pressurized chamber, the air vibrating with the low, rhythmic hum of a digital encryption line. David sat at the head of the obsidian table, flanked by 3 directors who stared into the glowing lens of the telepresence camera as if it were an oracle. Christina remained near the back, a silent observer in her blue and gold uniform, feeling the cold weight of the room's collective skepticism. On the screen, the French delegation was mid-sentence, their lead negotiator's tone sharpening into something jagged and defensive. The official translator, a man in a crisp charcoal suit who had barely acknowledged Christina's presence, leaned into his microphone. He relayed the French representative's terms, smoothing the edges of the jagged speech into a standard corporate compromise. David nodded, his pen hovering over a memorandum of understanding, ready to commit to a clause that would bind the company to a disastrous liability. Christina felt a cold prickle of alarm at the base of her neck. She hadn't just heard the words, she had heard the subtext. The translator had missed a crucial linguistic nuance, a double entendre in the French legal phrasing that shifted the burden of the unforeseen costs entirely onto David's firm. It was $1 million mistranslation, hidden behind a mask of professional politeness. For a heartbeat, the invisible habit of 13 years held her back. She was the one who emptied the bins, the one who moved in the shadows after the lights went out. To speak was to shatter the hierarchy that kept her safe in her anonymity. But as David's pen touched the paper, Christina's hand tightened on the back of her chair. She looked at James, who was watching from the corner of the screen with a knowing, expectant glint in his eye. She cleared her throat. The sound was small, yet in the vacuum of the high-stakes silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. The directors turned, their faces twisting into expressions of annoyed disbelief. David paused, his pen still. Christina didn't look at the board. She looked directly at the camera. In a voice that was calm, precise, and carried the undeniable authority of a scholar, she spoke. She didn't offer an opinion. She offered a correction, dismantling the mistranslation in the delegation's own tongue. The room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence as the French negotiators on the screen slowly leaned back, their predatory smiles fading into a stunned, newfound respect. By Wednesday morning, the corporate atmosphere had curdled. The news of Christina's sudden elevation to global advisor had bypassed the formal HR channels and traveled through the building's Slack channels and water cooler clusters with the heat of a brush fire. While David had seen a strategic marvel, the middle managers on the 12th floor saw an insult to their expensive degrees and years of ladder climbing. To them, Christina wasn't a genius discovered. She was a janitor who had jumped the queue, and their resentment manifested in 1,000 tiny, sharp needles of sabotage. When Christina arrived at her new glass-walled office, she found the invisible cloak had been replaced by a spotlight of cold hostility. The inner circle of management, led by directors who had ignored her for years, began a campaign of professional erasure. Essential meeting invites were mysteriously diverted from her calendar, and the briefing documents for the upcoming European summit arrived on her desk, with critical pages missing or data intentionally scrambled. In the staff lounge, the silence that greeted her entrance was louder than any insult. The same people who used to leave their coffee spills for her to clean now looked through her as if she were still a ghost. Only now it was out of malice rather than habit. One afternoon, Christina discovered a stack of urgent filing on her desk menial tasks that had nothing to do with global relations, accompanied by a sticky note from a junior VP that simply read, "Since you're so good at tidying up." She sat at her desk, the blue and gold uniform now replaced by a modest blazer, and felt the familiar weight of being underestimated. The sabotage was quiet, designed to make her stumble, to prove that a name tag could never truly belong in a room full of titles. But as she looked at the scrambled data they had given her, she began to see the patterns they had missed. They were trying to bury her in work, but they had accidentally handed her the very keys to the company's internal inefficiencies. Christina didn't report the slights to David. She simply straightened her posture and began to translate their chaos into a strategy they couldn't possibly ignore. The following Thursday, the simmering resentment of the 12th floor found its voice in Eleanor Craig, a senior board member with a reputation for surgical precision and a deep-seated reverence for traditional hierarchy. Eleanor had been with the company since its inception and viewed Christina's promotion as a stain on its prestige. She requested a briefing in the executive conference room, her sharp suits and even sharper tongue prepared for an execution. As Christina entered, Eleanor slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the mahogany table, a document supposedly containing the preliminary terms for a sensitive Swiss merger. "I've been told you have a gift for nuance, Christina," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a practiced, icy politeness. "This draft was sent by our Zurich office. It's riddled with archaic legalisms that our current team finds impenetrable. Perhaps you could summarize it for us?" The room went still. The other managers watched with bated breath, knowing the document was a linguistic minefield, a fake, filled with contradictory regional dialects and intentionally obsolete syntax, designed to make any translator look like an amateur. Christina opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages with a steady, unflinching focus. She recognized the trap immediately. The text wasn't just difficult. It was a Frankenstein's monster of linguistic tricks, meant to humiliate her in front of the board. For a long moment, Christina said nothing. Eleanor leaned back, a cold, predatory smile beginning to form as the silence stretched. But then, Christina reached into her pocket, pulled out a red pen, and began to write. She didn't struggle for a summary. Instead, she began to edit. With the fluid grace of a master scholar, she systematically dismantled the document, marking through the intentional errors and correcting the archaic grammar. "This isn't a merger draft, Eleanor," Christina said finally, her voice calm and carrying a weight that silenced the room. "It's a poorly constructed exercise in 19th century High German legalism. I've corrected the syntax on page 4 and aligned the regional dialects. If you'd like, I can rewrite it in contemporary business German, so that the board might actually be able to read it." Eleanor's smile vanished, replaced by a pale, stunned expression as she realized the janitor hadn't just avoided the trap, she had mastered it. Christina pushed the folder back across the table, her gaze steady and unbothered. She hadn't just survived the confrontation. She had proven that while Eleanor focused on the uniform, Christina was focused on the work. The private jet landed at Le Bourget, under a sky the color of wet slate, the air in Paris carrying a chill that even David's tailored overcoat couldn't quite deflect. The stakes for the merger had reached a fever pitch. The French partners, an old-world dynasty with deep roots in the city's industrial history, had grown increasingly cold and unreachable during the final stages of the negotiation. Inside the gilded boardroom of a private hotel particulier in the 8th arrondissement, the atmosphere was suffocatingly formal. David and his team of directors laid out their financial projections with clinical precision, pointing to spreadsheets that promised record-breaking dividends. Yet, the French patriarch sat across from them, his face a mask of polite, stony indifference, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the mahogany table. Christina sat at the edge of the delegation, her presence still a point of contention for Eleanor, who watched her with a hawk-like suspicion. While David focused on the numbers, Christina focused on the room. She noticed the way the French team exchanged sharp, fleeting glances whenever David addressed the patriarch by his first name, and how the Americans reached across the table to grab documents before they were offered. It wasn't the money that was the problem. The deal was bleeding out through 1,000 tiny cuts of unintentional disrespect. During a tense recess, David paced the marble balcony, his frustration boiling over. "Because you are speaking the language of money in a room that only values the language of tradition," Christina said, her voice steady against the wind. She explained that by bypassing the formal introductions and failing to acknowledge the patriarch's specific title, David had signaled that he viewed the merger as a conquest rather than a partnership. The Americans had treated the meeting like a transaction. The French viewed it as a marriage of legacies. When they returned to the table, Christina didn't wait for David to speak. She addressed the patriarch in a dialect of French so refined and archaic that even Eleanor looked stunned. She offered a formal apology on behalf of the firm for their brash Western haste, couching the apology in a series of traditional metaphors about roots and resilience. The tension in the room snapped like a dry twig. The patriarch's posture softened, his fingers stopped their tapping, and for the first time in 3 days, he smiled. The merger was back on, saved not by a spreadsheet, but by a woman who understood that sometimes the most important part of a deal is the silence between the words. The flight back from Paris was fueled by a quiet, electric triumph that the Chicago headquarters had sensed long before the private jet touched down. When the heavy glass doors of the executive floor slid open, the usual cacophony of a Tuesday afternoon, the frantic ringing of phones, the sharp staccato of debated deadlines died an instant, unnatural death. Christina stepped out behind David, no longer trailing in his shadow, but walking alongside him. As she moved down the corridor, the office fell into a heavy, profound silence that felt like a physical weight, but it was no longer the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of genuine, earned respect. The middle managers who had spent weeks orchestrating a campaign of petty sabotage now stood by their glass-walled offices, their hands still, their eyes following her with a stunned realization. There was no mocking whisper about uniforms or invisible staff. Even the junior VP, who had once left menial filing on her desk as a slight, stood frozen, with a look of humbled awe. They had seen the newswire. They knew that while they were polishing their titles, the woman they had mocked had been the only one capable of speaking the language that saved the firm's future. As Christina reached her desk, she found Eleanor Craig standing there. The senior board member didn't have a folder or a trap. She simply inclined her head in a gesture of acknowledgement that was more powerful than any apology. Christina placed her briefcase down, the silence of the room ringing in her ears. It was a stillness that acknowledged her not just as a linguist, but as an essential pillar of the company. For 13 years, she had moved through these halls like a ghost. Now, she was the center of the gravity. She looked around at the faces of the people who had once looked through her, and in that shared, breathless quiet, the hierarchy of the office was rewritten forever. Christina sat in her chair, the weight of the silence settling over her like a mantle of dignity, knowing that she had finally brought the light of the summit down to the shadows. The transition from the shadows to the summit was officially marked not by a ceremony, but by the quiet click of a closet door. Christina stood in her bedroom, looking at the blue and gold service uniform one last time. It had been her armor for 13 years, a fabric woven with the quiet dignity of a woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to keep the lights on for others. She folded it with a scholar's precision and placed it in a cedar chest. But as she reached for the small plastic name tag, she paused. She didn't tuck it away. Instead, she gripped it firmly in her palm, feeling the sharp edges of the identity she had fought to redefine. When she arrived at her new executive office on the 18th floor, the mahogany desk was bare, save for a single orchid and the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline that she no longer had to view through a cleaning cloth. She placed the old name tag in the center of a brushed steel tray, a permanent reminder that brilliance often walks the halls in silence. David stopped by her doorway, his expression one of quiet pride as he watched her settle in. They didn't need words to acknowledge the shift. The Hidden Talent Initiative they had drafted was already being implemented, a program designed to ensure that no other Christina would ever go unnoticed in the hallways of Hallberg International again. Later that afternoon, a young man from the maintenance crew, a shy immigrant named Matteo, who spoke 4 languages but rarely looked up from his mop, was summoned to the executive floor. He entered Christina's office with the same hesitant, invisible posture she once knew so well. Christina rose from her chair, her gaze warm and steady, and gestured to the seat across from her. She didn't start with a contract or a title. She began by asking him about his story in his native tongue. As the young man's eyes widened with the shock of being truly seen, Christina realized that her journey hadn't just been about her own promotion. It was about bringing a few more chairs to the table. She was no longer just a linguist or an advisor. She was the new standard, a living bridge between the world that worked and the world that led.